And, and I would like to introduce our speaker, Emily Ferguson. Emily's fascination with trees started when she was young. Her focus on the variety of trees found in Virginia happened while living in the central Blue Ridge Mountains outside of Charlottesville. After graduating from the 2011 Tree Stewards of Arlington and Alexandria class, Emily began to teach tree ID. Nora initially trusted her with the very next incoming TS class, which has flourished into teaching tree ID by season for the Charlottesville area tree stewards, among other things, where she is based today. When she isn't teaching, Emily can often be found outside with her dogs, a hand lens, and a field guide. And she tells me that she was inspired to do a deep dive into this family after watching my maple presentation that I gave last October. So take it away, Emily.
Thank you, Paul, for the introduction. And it's lovely to be back with the Northern Virginia crowd. I often lurk from a distance, especially on your Zoom things, because you always have such great programs. Tonight, I wanted to talk about the Betulaceae family, and I called it the search for the birch because there seemed to be lots more than I ever really anticipated. And I thought it would be a good way to sort of round out this piece. And I think I decided this was going to talk about inspiration, talk about a little bit about the family it's overall, some of the folklore associated with it, and then I was going to wrap it up by what we find here in Charlotte, in the Virginia area for this species. So let's talk about the inspiration first. When I first started looking at this, I was like, who on earth knows anything about the birch tree? And to my surprise, I found a little ditty about the birch swinging on a birch tree, and it's one of those poems that rhymes, and it was done in 1867. So I was pretty surprised that there, way back when, people were already thinking and appreciating the birch tree, and I thought that was really neat. From there, I found that Robert Frost has done some poetry on the birches, and this one I think is more towards the white birch because it's talking about the snow white trunk. But again, it was pretty nice seeing that these birch trees have been an inspiration all along from the very beginning. So not only did they inspire these poets and songwriters, they inspired me obviously to do a deep dive into them. And this was the shocking part for me, is that Robert Frost did two pieces about the young birch, and this was his second one called A Young Birch, and this was a piece from that as well. So I was inspired right from the very start because it looked like people had been talking about these trees since the very beginning of coming over and settling in the Americas. So I wanted to get into the family tree, and this might take a little bit of time, and I will try very hard not to give any jargon. When I talk about the family tree, I want to go back all the way to the fact that we started with gymnosperms that were producing pollen that was not in a flower and produced cones, and that is how it was all done through wind dispersal for pollination. And then we got to the angiosperms, which are considered the covered seed group. And this is where flowers began to take their, it was their leaping off point when we started with the magnolia. So I have the magnolia at the top, which is a sweet bay. We've given those away in plenty of our free tree giveaways in Northern Virginia, which were always so much fun to be part of. And then I went all the way down to the flowering dogwood, which I would consider almost like the composite of the flowering trees, because we have those showy bracts on the outside, and then we have a cluster of flowers all nestled in the center, which is pretty specialized and advanced when we think of flowering plants and trees, because the first maple or first magnolia was sort of like, oh my goodness, we're going from wind pollination to trying to attract flies and beetles. And the idea was to have lots of all the parts. So lots of petals, lots of stamen, lots of carpels, in the hope and crossing fingers that it'll attract insects in order for pollination to happen. And that was a big deal. So that was the first flowering plant that we had, or one of the first flowering families. So not to really belabor the point, but I want to make sure that we have the idea of what a flower is. On the outside, we're going to have, and at the bottom, we're going to have the stem coming up. We'll have the sepals on the bottom, and then we'll have petals surrounding the sepals. And then inside the petals, we'll have the filaments, which are the long, thin pieces. And then we'll have the anther on top. And you guys can see my pointer, correct?
Yes.
And that has the pollen inside it. And then in the very center of the flower, we're going to have the stigma, style, and ovary with the ovule. And those are all the female parts. And when we think of a flower, we think of, you have to think of the apical meristem, which is the growing portion of a plant, and it's putting out whorls of modified leaves. So that first part is a whorl of sepals, and then you're going to have another whorl on top of that of all of our petals, a whorl of all the male parts of the flower, and then that last inner whorl of the female parts of the flower. And we have perfect flowers, which is what I would call our magnolia flowers, because they have both male and female parts. We also would consider that a complete flower because it contains all four of the major flower parts, from sepals to petals to male and female pieces. And then we can have flowers that are imperfect or unisexual, where they only have male or only have female parts. And we're going to see a little bit more of that as we go further. And just as a quick reminder, the anther and filament together equal the stamen, and the stigma, style, and ovary are the pistil. So stamen is male parts of the flower and pistil is female. Before I get too much further, we should talk about this guy, Mr. Carl Linnaeus. He was the person who is the father of modern taxonomy. And as we break down this family, we have to start with plants, and then we have to get to phylum, which he originally called division. Then we'll do class, order, family, and then we'll finally get to genus and species. So we've been talking about the Betulaceae family, but we're going to go a little bit higher than that to talk about the other pieces that get us to that family location, so that we can sort of trace the lineage all the way down through the different plant families and how things sort of shook out when we looked at everything as a whole. So the part that's really interesting is that initially there was this group called the Amentiferae, which was all of the families that had this vegetative piece that's a characteristic that comes down, and you can see a picture of it right here. They're also called catkins or aments, and this is what was considered something that moved this family from being an early successional family like the magnolias further down the spectrum, but not all the way to where we get to the cornus where the dogwood is. So we're somewhere smack in the middle, because this shows some very advanced features along with some primitive features when we look at the twigs and the arrangement of leaves on those twigs. So it was very interesting finding this out, because every time I group plants together, I always put like I put the populus and the salix and the phagales and all of the so the oaks, the willow, the beeches, or sorry, the birches, all sort of together, because I think they have similarities between them. And here's that catkin, which I already said is also called an ament. And here we have the birch, we have the oak, we have the willow. These were all considered part of the same family or grouping under that Amentiferae. Other things that included were also the casuarina and the wax myrtle. If you guys have been further south to Florida, you'll have run into that. The phagales, which is all the oaks, and the things in the Juglandaceae, the walnuts were part of this, and the hickories, because they're part of walnuts. So it was pretty interesting. And the willow was kind of a fringe species because that one actually is pollinated by insects rather than having wind pollination, which is going on here. And that's really cool. So we went from magnolias that are trying to attract insects to do pollination to deciding, you know what, that's not really working for us. We're going to go back to this wind pollination thing, which is sort of a step back evolutionarily, but it was a more successful way for these plants to survive because they're still here today. So the one thing also we have to talk about here is these are preformed. So this means that most of these plants, as we go into the winter months, these catkins or aments are already formed and sitting on the trees, waiting for the warm weather of the next season to elongate and shake out pollen if that's what they're doing, or be receptive to receiving pollen if they're female. So I think that's pretty cool. And this is a little bit of a scary slide, so don't get too worried, but I wanted to sort of show you the whole progression here. So we have these, the super rosids, that we get to the roses, and then we get to these faboids, and then we come down here and we take a couple steps and we get to these this phagales piece, and that's where we have the Betulaceae, the Fagaceae, the Juglandaceae. So this is all of our birches. This is our beech and our oaks, as well as our chestnut. And then the Juglandaceae is going to be our walnuts and our hickories. So all of these guys are sort of sitting in the same place with the phagales. And then you look up here, this is where our willow ended up. It sort of got cut off and put elsewhere. And this is considered a phylogeny, or and it's supposed to show the evolutionary history of the groups and how they're related to one another. And it's interesting how much of the ament family sort of stayed together in the phagales, but how sometimes it still has split up and pieces have gone elsewhere. And we should think of this system as still in flux, because things are always changing as we learn more information. So when they started doing phylogeny, we originally did it by the different characteristics that we saw on plants, and that was visual. And now phylogeny is done with genetics. So they're actually looking at mitochondrial DNA and different parts of the DNA in plants cells and trying to order plants that way. So things have gotten sort of shaken up and moved around, but it's interesting how close some of these things have stayed despite all of these shakings and things that have happened. So even though this looks like it might be a done deal, don't ever think of anything in science as done. There's always going to be someone out there that's going to be questioning it and coming up with different things to talk about. So here are my arrows, and they're a little late on the slide, but that's the phenology that I thought we should think about and be talking about as we think into this whole family of species. So we should talk about the range of this family. Really interestingly, there are 6 different genus or genera that are associated with this, and we have 5 of those here in North America. That's really quite good. We have, a total of 150 worldwide, and here in North America, we have a total of about, I'd say, roughly 30 of those. And while we don't have the 150, we still have quite a number of species. And I'm going to hold off on where they are in Virginia until we get to the actual species that are here in Virginia, because I first want to go into the characteristics of the family. So this family is either a tree or a shrub that are deciduous, and they're monoecious. Deciduous means they lose their leaves every year, and monoecious means that they have both male and female flowers on the same tree or shrub. And we saw earlier that they're actually provided in catkins, and that's almost always the males that are in catkins, and then the females can be in catkins as well, or something just a little bit different. A lot of the twigs will have lenticels on them, lenticel lines or dots or a pattern on them, and they talk about that being in the Betula, which are the birches, the Annuals, which are the alders, and Ostrya, which is the hornbeam. The leaves are deciduous, they're alternate, and they are stipulate, so they usually have little tiny baby vestiges of leaves. So if you think of a rose, at the very base of that compound leaf, there's two little tiny green pieces that are on either side of the stem, and that is what stipules are. And when we started tonight, Nora was talking about finding something that she thought was black locust. On black locust, there's those two pronged barbs on the stem. Those are actually woody stipules. So sometimes they're there and sometimes they're not. It's often a simple leaf, and it's usually looks like it's unfolded like from pleats along the lateral vein, which is why I put these leaves in here. They're unfolding from the pleats of the lateral vein to unfurl. The margins of the leaves are usually toothed or double toothed and sometimes dentate, and they turn a beautiful yellow color in fall, almost all of the species in this family. As I said earlier, the flowers are small and unisexual. The male flowers are arranged in catkins, and almost all of those are preformed except for in the carpinus, which we'll get to later, and that's the musclewood. And the female flowers can be in catkins or in clusters, and we'll look at those too. The fruit are usually nutlets on bracts, and they sometimes look like cones. And we'll see some of those. Interestingly, this family of trees has some economic importance, and they're edible nuts, hazelnuts or filberts, and that's in the Corylus. Interestingly, someone asked me the other day, what's the difference between a filbert and a hazelnut? And I was like, there's got to be something between them, because I see them written out hazelnuts and filberts, but I have been proved incorrect. So they only use filberts when it's commercially cultivated. Otherwise, it's hazelnuts. And the origin of filbert has either two origins. In German, the Volbart means folded beard, full beard, and I think Volbart turns to filbert for the bearded husks around that cover the shell, and I've tried to put an example of that on this picture slide for you. Or it's from the French monk Saint Philbert, whose feast day is August 22nd, which coincides when the fruit is ripe. So I don't know which one's right, but they're both talked about. Then they have the wintergreen oil that's used medicinally and for flavoring candy and gum. That's usually distilled from the twigs, bark, or wood. People have made birch beer from the Betula, and that was used originally by fermenting the sap that was tapped from trees in early spring. And when I mentioned birch beer, someone asked me about root beer, so I thought I should look that up too. That was originally made from sarsaparilla and sassafras root, but they both contain safrole, which was banned by the FDA because it was considered carcinogenic. So now root beer is made with a mixture of vanilla and birch oil. The lumber is also important for from the Betula as well as from the alder, and they used my husband heard and continues to be ready that if you take the curly pieces of the bark from the exfoliation that they do, they're excellent fire starters because they're highly flammable. And he keeps his piece in his car for if he ever has to start a fire because of traffic on the highway. I'm not really sure, but that's where it lives. And there's a lot of ornamental trees in this family too. I also wanted to look up the wildlife value. So it seems that there's a lot of animals out there that like to eat the nuts, the buds, the catkins, the seed, bark. It looks like everybody likes to munch on this tree, which I thought was kind of surprising. And it was interesting to see. And I think it's good to know that there is a lot of native animals that are interested in using these species for either cover or to find food, even in the winter months, which is great. And these days we all hear about Doug Ptolemy's backyard to national park idea, and I probably butchered that, so excuse me. But he's written a piece about the Keystone native species, and these are native species that are critical to the food web and are needed for wildlife species. And I was really excited to see where Betula landed on his tree list as number 3 for the sweet birch and the river birch. And the number of caterpillar hosts that use that plant is over 284 species, which is pretty crazy high. And then for he also had a shrub section where the alder showed up, and that's another 173 species that use the host plant to it's in some way to complete their life cycle. And I think that's interesting, and that's also really good. A lot of times when I saw river birch planted, I always used to be suspect of how well they were, especially when they were coming from the trade. This doesn't talk about if their species are coming from the horticultural trade, whether or not they have the same keystone ability for the food web and the native species, but hopefully there's still some pieces that make it worthwhile. And then the folklore. I was really surprised. So the god Thor, if you were considered the birch tree to be sacred, and those that hung branches in their homes were protected from the evil eye, lightning, and infertility. Interestingly enough, the hazel was also considered something that protected you from lightning in churches, which just churches was a little surprising, but that's what I found. And medieval pilgrims would carry the hazel branches with them to keep themselves safe from thieves and cutthroats along their journey. And a wreath of hazel worn on a ship kept the vessel from having a shipwreck. Don't know the validity of these things or how often they prevented and took care of people, but I still thought it was pretty interesting, all the folklore that was described for these species of trees. And then the birch leaves and twigs, interestingly enough, everybody agrees. So early Americans, Europeans, and Native Americans, they thought that you could use it as a diuretic for breaking kidney and bladder stones. You could use it as a natural astringent to stop things from discharging, fluids from discharging from your body. Not sure how many of those I want, but for scurvy and burns, it was supposed to be helpful. It was a pain reliever to help calm irritations like sore throats, upset stomachs, and fever. And they also use the twigs to prevent as a preventative for tooth decay. Widely used apparently by all those different groups of people. And also that birch wintergreen smell that we find in the plants, especially the yellow and black birch, has almost the exact same chemistry as wintergreen in the wild. So I put a wintergreen little flower here for you guys to see. This is striped wintergreen in flower, and you can see there's several around it. I can't imagine which is easier to get birch oil from, or this methyl salicate from, because it would probably be that you could get more from a birch rather than this tiny little wildflower that's out there. But they're the only plants in the world that naturally contain this chemical. And these are aspirin-like compounds. So some people, I think that's where we get the pain relief thing that we talked about previously. That spicy aroma is usually used to disguise disagreeable taste. You can use it as a skin wash. If you put a palm full of fresh leaves in a cup of boiling water and steep it for 2 to 3 minutes, you can combat your acne. And there's a Swiss firm that has birch products that use the oil for massage and soothing. So it seems to have a lot going on for it, and people must really like it. Getting back to the present, I recently took a tree communications class with the New York Botanical Gardens, and I was surprised to see that alders have been used to figure out how trees are communicating with one another. And this study was looking at the leaf beetle, and they were either mechanically or actually allowing herbivory to these alders, and they're trying to see what impact that had on the trees next door or nearby. And this tree communication was above ground through air, and it was volatile organic compounds that are traveling through the air and they are alerting the nearby alders to increase their resistance to prevent herbivory. And over time, the older leaves contained and retained that resistance to herbivory, but younger leaves would lose it. And that they hadn't decided whether that was due to them being so new that they hadn't been around when the defoliation happened, or it was they weren't sure what the other what other mechanism there could be. And they also found that the further you were away from the alder that was getting either mechanically or actually eaten, the less effects you would see, because the volatile organic compounds were not going far enough to get to the entire alder stand. So this is cutting edge stuff that's happening right now. Obviously, this is above ground. I'm sure everybody's read or talked about the mother tree. That sort of talks about the wood wide web, which is also new. And this is the underground interactions between tree roots and mycorrhizal fungi. And they're studying the connections between these to see how movement of nutrients might be happening. And because I just took this course, I had a list of all the families and genera and the type of mycorrhizal relationship they had. And if it's an ectomycorrhizal, then, if it's an ectomycorrhizal, then the fungi is surrounding the root. And that's only 2% of taxa that are like that. And the rest of taxa, or 74% of the taxa, I should say, not all of them, are endomycorrhizal, and that's where there's penetration of that fungi into the roots of the tree. And then there's the question of how the nutrients are moving. Is it through like a sink source where this tree has lots of nutrients and things to give away? So it's just sort of drifting from where there is abundance of it to where there's a lack of or less of, or is there fungi actually regulating the process? And the jury's still out on some of this stuff, but the symbiotic fungi that's linking plants together through this wood wide web is moving these nutrients. And then you have to consider like what nutrients can be moved. They're talking about carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, water, lipids have even been seen to be moving in these fungal, and even stress hormones. So as trees are getting attacked or being chopped down, whatever attacked means, they're sending out these hormones, and the science has not gotten far enough to figure out what the receiving tree is doing, but we have seen movement of these things through radioactive tags and things like that, passing things back and forth. And I thought it was interesting that the Betula family is mostly ecto, except for the alders that are endo and ecto. So they have both types of fungi happening for them. So let's look at the species here in Virginia and stop being so wild and crazy. So for the Betulaceae family in North America, we have, as I said earlier, almost 30 representatives. In the flora of Virginia, there's about 12 species. The ones that have the asterisks next to them, those I'm not going to be talking about as much because I am not as familiar with them. But it's great to see that we have such a good representation of all of the genera that are out there here in North America, and in the state of Virginia, we have such a wide collection of these, and I think that's fantastic because it makes it really easy to show and to find in order to talk about them. So our first one is going to be the SmoothAlder, or Alnus serrulata, and this one's found from Eastern North America, and all the way from Maine all the way down to Florida. And this loves to be near the water, and you can see the water in the background of this picture as I have my hand behind the catkins and the female reproductive pieces that almost look like cones. The bark is a little fluted on the trees, and they have a wavy edge on the edge of their leaves. And then here it is again. It has these twigs that are, they can be reddish brown and fuzzy, and then the buds are stalked, and they're usually red purple, covered with red purple scales. And we have this woody cone-like piece that's the female flower. It doesn't start looking like that. It actually starts looking a lot smaller. And then we have these catkins. And these will persist through winter. And these are going to be the catkins that also go through winter as well. And this spring, we have the female catkins that sort of point upwards, and they have this dark purple coloration, and then you can see the little wispy pieces hanging out of them. Those are going to be the stigma that's going to be receptive to the pollen. These are the catkins up close, and all these are going to be, these are all incomplete flowers because they don't have all 4 parts of the flower. They're missing the sepals and they're missing the petals, and they're usually missing either the male or female parts. So our female flowers over here, all we have are the sepals, and you can see the stigma here, probably the style is underneath there, and then the ovaries underneath. And on these male catkins here, all we have are tons of filaments, and filaments with stamen on the filaments with anthers on the top, and pollen just hanging out. And it's great when you go and see these, you can just see the wind pushing pollen across and away from them. If anybody is allergic to the birch, be very careful during this time of year because there's lots of pollen out in the air because of them. So that's our annulus, our alder, and up here in the mountains we also have that speckled alder, and they consider that a relic species because it has, when after the ice sheets came down, we actually weren't covered with ice here in Virginia from the Ice Age, but as it warmed up and species went back northward, some species either went northward, others may have gone up a mountain to try and get that colder elevation. And that's why we have the speckled alder up in the mountains near me. Here's river birch, and this is one that I see a lot when I'm out and about. It's a beautiful tree. It's usually in the floodplains. I don't actually see it in the water. I will see it on river banks, older species. A lot of times I see this planted. And this is, again, it has these beautiful little green leaves that look like they have pleats in them. We have the female flower catkin piece here. And actually this one's heading straight up. Usually catkins for female catkins go point upwards and males go down. And here's some male catkins down. And these are some beautiful flowers in here as well. And it's usually when you grab one of these branches that have the female cone-like aggregate on it, if you pull that off the tree, usually when you pull it off the tree, the whole thing disperses all the leaves, all the seeds, because it falls apart instantly. And I can't tell you how many times I've tried to pick one up so I can take a look at it, get it home to review it, but I never make it home in time. It's already fallen apart in the car. So then I have to clean out the car instead. And this is just a picture of the catkins against the sky from the trees that were in our backyard in Arlington. They have this beautiful bark on their tree. So we talked earlier about how the Betulaceae or the Betula also always usually have lenticel lines on them. They're not as apparent on these river birch bark pieces, but they are still there. I think of this as more like a watercolor with the lenticel lines on them. It's a little bit more abstract art. As it says here, riversides and streams is where they like to be. They don't usually get to be a very big tree. They grow up to be about 70 feet tall. They have that beautiful exfoliating bark that has a little bit of a salmony color underneath, and that's why it's so popular in the horticultural trade. Here's a sweet or black birch. I tend to call it black birch because it looks black to me. It has alternate leaves that are pinnately veined, and you can see that it has the buds on this branch right here. It often will have, I'll talk about that on the next slide. It has the monoecious flowers. So here are the males hanging down, and you can see the females sort of pointing up. And these again are preformed, so they're on the tree all the way through winter. And then here is the female fruit. Looks like a cone that will break apart really easily if you touch it. I find that the bark, as I said earlier, makes this tree look very dark. And you can see the lenticel lines on this bark here. And the twigs are awesome because they have these spur shoots. And the only other tree that I think of when I think of spur shoots is the ginkgo that has a spur shoot as well. But this is a great way to show alternate branching patterns because of these little spur shoots making it so obvious. It's a medium-sized tree that's usually single-trunked, and it grows about 60 feet tall. It likes moist areas, but it doesn't like to have its roots in water. And that's unlike this one here, the yellow birch. This one could actually be feet totally in the water with wetness. And here is that shreddy yellowness to the bark, but you can still see the lenticel lines on here. It's usually found further up in the mountains at higher elevation. So here where I live in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I see a lot of this species. But when you get down into down near Arlington and Alexandria, I don't see the species at all. I do see the black birch or the sweet birch, especially out at Scott's Run. I see a lot of examples of it out there. And when I was putting together this presentation, I got a question from Paul about the multi-trunk thing that's going on that sometimes I guess is referred to as Frankenstein tree. So I had to look that up in the Horticultural Trade, and thanks to Arbor Day, they had some ideas here for me. This is usually done with the paper birch or the river birch, and because they're resistant to deer, people like them in their yards, and because of that cool bark that they have, that makes them even more interesting. And people like the clumps rather than the single trunk tree. So if you can only get the single trunk tree, Arbor Day has the 3 ways that you can make your own. So you can either create it by buying the pre-clumped in nurseries, and the next option is to cut back. So what you would do is let it grow for at least 2 seasons so that it gets a nice established root system, and then you would cut it back right at the base, and then it'll send out sprouts, multiple trunks. And then you have to pare that down from like 6 to hopefully like 3 or 4 at the most. And then the last option is to plant 3 trees all together in the same hole to get that clumped look of the birch out in your yard. And when I lived in Arlington, I had 2 clumps of 3 birches, river birches in my yard. And it was funny, whenever we looked at houses when we lived in Arlington, because we spent a lot of time looking for a house to buy when we were there, I would always find a river birch planted really close to the house. And I was surprised by that because this tree is a little bit messy. It's a beautiful tree, but it tends to drop a lot of branches and be a little bit weak during windstorms. So if the tree was about 60 or 70 years old, I would think it was topping out on its age, and I would be looking at the trees that we would have to remove as soon as we purchased the property. Luckily, the property we did buy, these river birch clumps were not close to the house itself, so that wasn't something we had to worry about. They're also really greedy. They like a lot of water. I wanted to put all 3 species together for you. So here's the leaf for, and I think so here's the river birch with its beautiful bark underneath it. And here's the black birch with these spur shoots with that darker bark with a really clear lenticel lines on it. And here's the yellow birch leaves with the yellow birch bark underneath with the shreddy yellowish color to it. It should be noted that the river birch will not have the wintergreen smell. Only the sweet and yellow birch will. And of the 2, the yellow birch apparently produces the most of the wintergreen oil. I also took these in the fall so that you could see what the fall color is. As I said earlier, they have beautiful yellow coloration in the fall. We have the river birch here. Then we have the sweet or black birch, and then we have the yellow birch, and you can see it's literally in a stream in this picture, which is kind of cool. The next piece in this family that we're going to look at is the Carpinus caroliniana, and this one likes to be in sort of moist woods. I often see it stretching out over rivers and streams. And this has a very muscular bark that's smooth. And to remember this tree, I think of Carpe Diem, and I have my sinewy, muscly arm here that you can not see because it's covered with a long sleeve shirt. But that sinewy, muscly for Carpe Diem reminds me that Carpinus is what this tree is. And that helps me not get it mixed up with the other tree that has some similarities with this. And you can see, you can find it all the way from near northern Florida all the way up into lower Canada. And it has these cool little bracts underneath here that I'll show you in a minute. So the leaves are alternate and simple. And we have some leaves here with the little nutlet fruit that's hanging down here. This is the female flower right here, and these are the male catkins hanging down. And Carpinus, remember, is the one that does not have the preformed catkins. So these actually appear after the leaves start coming out. They start pushing out these catkins, whereas all of the other species we've seen prior to this have the catkins form prior to us going into the winter months. And it has all these common names, which I can't keep track of. American hornbeam, musclewood, ironwood, blue beech, probably has others, but I would, if I could, I'd try and get rid of that American hornbeam and stick with musclewood for this, but because of that carpe diem and that sinewy bark, but I am not going to change that as one person. So I'll let that go. And apparently hornbeam means hard wood. So that's what I read. And then the other one is Hophornbeam, and this is Ostrya virginiana. And this has leaves that are very similar to the last species that we looked at. The flowers are going to be in preformed catkins for the males, and the fruit is very distinct. This is a really good way to tell these two species apart, because the fruit they look like hops, which is why it's the hop hornbeam. And the hornbeam or Ostrya apparently means hardwood again. So that's a helpful hint. And the interesting part about this is it has lenticulines on the young bark of the twigs and the young trees, but when it gets older, it has this very shreddy looking bark, and it has a similar range to the last species. And one of the things I like to do when I do teach these two trees is then to show them side by side. The leaves, as I said, aren't going to be very helpful, but you'll always have the bark to help you. And if it's got this sinewy bark, you know that you're looking at our carpinus, which is the American hornbeam. And if you've got this shreddy looking bark and these delicate, simple leaf branching pattern with these hoppy looking fruit, you have the hop hornbeam. Oh, and there's the names. The next one is on our list is the American hazelnut. And this one I didn't really know very well until I got to this area, and it is absolutely gorgeous. It has catkins that hang down. They come out at around the same time as the alder catkins, but these are much more greeny yellow. They don't get the reddish color that's in the alders that we saw earlier. And this is another shrub that's in this group. The alders are a shrub as well. We've got the hazelnuts here, and we have the female flowers on the end here. They're absolutely stunning. They look like little pineapples with their pink tassels for their flowers hanging out the top. And those pink pieces are going to be the receptive stigma waiting for pollen from these beautiful male catkins that are just shaking pollen in the breeze. And here is the hazelnut again. It almost disguises itself when it actually has the nuts on it. It's absolutely gorgeous, and it's found pretty wide ranging from Oklahoma to Saskatchewan over to Maine and down towards Georgia. And I usually find this along streams when it's a little bit open. So I sort of find it in the same habitat as the alder. And the last one that we should look at is the beaked hazelnuts. And this one I think is really cool. This one I find up in the mountains as well. And it has this long fuzzy beak. And as it gets older, it gets harder, and those little things that look like hairs right here become little like prickles. So when I harvested these for my husband and I brought them home, he was surprised at how spiny it was and evil. So he wasn't excited to crack it open to find the nut inside. And you can see here's the female flower. And this year, these stigma are so much longer than the one we saw on the last slide. So another beautiful plant that's a shrub that's out there. And that, I think, is it. So I want to thank everybody for joining me and listening to me talk about the Betulaceae family.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was a truly scholarly talk with wonderful pictures and explanations. I do not see any questions in the chat, but I think that our group is small enough that if people want to raise their hand, turn on their video and raise their hand, I would be happy to call on people to ask questions.